So in addition to red blood cells, of course, we have white blood cells. Now, before this class, you may have thought maybe all white blood cells were the same, but they're actually not. You have five different little subpopulations of white blood cells that are constantly circulating around the body. Now, white blood cells are primarily there for immune defense, right? So if you get a germ past your skin and into your body somewhere where the germs could actually start an infection, white blood cells are recruited to the area, and they have, well, a whole arsenal of, defense tactics to actually thwart the infection. What I'm not going to do right now is get into that because, again, you do have a whole unit on immunity, and I think it's much better to, bring that up then and talk about the details then rather than just be redundant by the time we get there. So I'm just going to say leukocytes specifically engage invaders of the body. That's why you have five types, is that they are actually pretty good and at specialized jobs depending on what type of leukocyte you have. Now, just by appearance, you can tell that you have sort of two different populations. One are called granulocytes, right? So you can break these five here into three. Granulocytes look like they're full of little granules, which kind of makes sense. Granules being like these little, almost kind of looks like they're full of sand or something, right? So those granules contain all kinds of defensive compounds that will help a white blood cell fight off an infection. So I think that that's important. Okay. Agranulocytes, which are the left two, let me just get my pen out here, which are the left two. Whoops. They have very few organelles inside. So as you can see a nucleus there, but you really can't see. So I think that that's definitely important to consider. So broadly we have two different populations, but within those two we actually have more, right? We have five total. So let me just tell you really briefly what the jobs are of these leukocytes. So granulocytes occur in three different types. Basophils produce histamine. Okay, now histamine is probably something you've heard before, not maybe as histamine itself, but as antihistamines, right? So if you have a sinus infection and your tissue's really inflamed, you go on an antihistamine to, basically bring the inflammation down. Well, what caused the inflammation in the first place were histamines, which is why you take an antihistamine. That's what leads to the inflammatory response. Basophils, the rarest population of white blood cells, are responsible for inflammation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in immunity, as I said before. Neutrophils phagocytize bacteria and viruses. Now, I think probably everybody's familiar with this. Phagocytosis is when this white blood cell will literally eat a germ that they encounter in your body. So if you have like a little bacteria cell right here or something like that, you can imagine, this bacteria is pretty much just engulfed by this white blood cell and then destroyed on the inside, right? You can tell that you have a neutrophil by looking at the lobes of the nucleus. Here looks like there's five, but they can range anywhere from 3 to 6. By the way, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you about the basophils. Basophils kind of, to me, look like a smiley face, right? Look at that, right? All right, so it almost looks like an old-fashioned telephone is inside them. That's what really gives away white blood cells. The shape of the nucleus is the best indicator to determine what their population they belong to. Eosinophils at the very, very, probably the most specialized granulocytes. They have a nucleus that looks like a pair of kidneys to me. And they lead the attack against, they're specialized against leading the attack against parasitic worms, but they do other things as well. They also can function as generalist germ killers and things, right? So they have that bilobe nucleus. They can also phagocytize bacteria, but they do lead the attack against parasitic worms. So what does that tell you? Wow, parasitic worms must have been a real huge problem for our ancestors for us to evolve a blood cell type that was actually, specialized to fight them off, right? So I think that's an interesting, thing to look at in that it's, kind of telling how we evolved and what immune challenges we faced along the way. Now, lymphocytes are probably, I don't want to say the most valuable, but man, do they do a huge job and have a huge impact in getting rid of different diseases. Lymphocytes produce antibodies. Antibodies are separate little protein molecules that kind of look like a Y, uh, kind of look like this. So these would be the chains of the proteins that make them up. Um, what that's going to do is really enhance the immune response. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that because again, we have an immunity chapter, but B lymphocytes produce antibodies to pathogens. So those are the primary antibody producers. T lymphocytes, on the other hand, produce cytokines. Cytokines, if this is a new term for you, are basically cell messengers, a lot like hormones, but they're chemicals that help to direct the immune response. So they're released by T lymphocytes, they'll go to other cells and initiate a change in them to help fight off an infection. Okay, so T lymphocytes themselves also come in two different types: CD4 cells, which are the ones that actually direct the immune response. So they're kind of like the communicators or what we call helper cells. And then CD8 cells, which are kind of like serial killers, I gotta say. They go around and they kill anything that looks different that shouldn't be in the body, right? So we'll again talk about these a lot more. So these cells are the heart of adaptive immunity. They and their clones, so they will clone themselves when you have an infection, will remember the antibodies they produced and therefore have even more efficient immune responses. Sorry, there's a motorcycle outside. Even more efficient immune responses in the future. All right, so again, just going to leave it at that. Those antibodies, though, we'll come back to. Leukocytes, as far as monocytes go, function to phagocytize bacteria and other invading pathogens. These are actually relatively large cells that really clear out the body by phagocytizing, as you can see right here, invading pathogens. Again, they literally are eating them, they're engulfing them. And we'll talk about phagocytosis a lot more later. So what they do is eventually they'll mature into macrophages, macro meaning really big, and phage meaning to eat, right? Which can leave the blood vessels and enter tissues. Now, we haven't talked about the circulatory system in particular yet, but these cells, which are generally, blood should always be contained in a vessel, otherwise you're bleeding somewhere you shouldn't be. These cells do something a little bit different. They can go through a process, or more like a behavior, really, which is called diapedesis. Now, you like to think, if you think about your body, I like to know that, my skin cells are going to stay put, my bone cells are going to stay put, my fat cells are going to stay put, because they really don't move very much. They just kind of sit there. Your blood is a little bit different, though, especially the white cells. White cells will go and track down an infection, right? They'll literally follow the smell. I know that sounds gross, but the smell, the chemicals that are given off by an infection, and be attracted to the source. Like think throwing chum in the water for sharks, right? When they do that, then they start to break down and destroy anything that shouldn't be there, like bacteria in a cut or something like that. So I want to let you know that, like I said, we pretty much, like to think that we're in control of ourselves. These are like rogue wolves. They'll just leave your blood vessels and go hunting throughout your tissues for infection. So it's really interesting to think about that. But it's also very efficient because there you go, right? I mean, those infections are going to be handled even if there isn't a blood cell or a blood vessel in the immediate vicinity. Okay, so we're just going to leave it at that for blood. Okay, again, we'll get back to some more of the details later, but um, we should probably talk about where blood cells come from, right? So the origins of blood cells, right, how they're actually produced is a process called erythropoiesis. Okay, um, erythropoiesis happens in your bone marrow. Okay, primarily, well, as an adult anyway, the ends of long bones. So that would be like the top of your humerus in your shoulder, the head of your femur in your hip. That's really where most of your blood cells are being produced and eventually let out into your circulatory system. So we have erythrocytes, which are red blood cells again, leukocytes, which are white, and platelets. They are all produced in the same tissue. Okay, so I'm going to outline how they're produced in the next 3 slides. So all red blood cells, which obviously make up the majority of the volume of cells in your body, develop from undifferentiated stem cells in the red bone marrow. Now, if you don't know what a stem cell is pretty much just a human cell. It's kind of like almost like in an embryonic form. It's not a fat cell, it's not a nerve cell or skin or blood or muscle or any of that stuff. It's just a human cell that has the potential to turn into any one of those that I just mentioned. Well, in the bone marrow, there's a certain cocktail of chemicals, which I don't really think we need to get into. It's really ridiculous biochemistry. So that will eventually turn stem cells, these undifferentiated cells, first into a committed cell, What that means is they're committed now to turning into a blood cell, and then they'll go, as you can see to the right, uh, and they'll start to do everything to make them a red blood cell. Eventually, their nucleus is going to be ejected. They're going to develop hemoglobin through ribosome synthesis of the hemoglobin protein. And then eventually, they're going to form that little biconcave shape over here, and there you get a mature red blood cell. Okay. Note the ejection of the nucleus. What do you need a nucleus for if you're just carrying, oxygen around the body, right? So the central control center of red blood cells is pretty much gone, right? They just eject it just so that they can hold that much more oxygen. White blood cells develop from the same undifferentiated stem cells in the red bone marrow. Okay, if you didn't have ANP1, I just want to let you know that red bone marrow is what is going through blood cell production. White, or sometimes people call it yellow bone marrow, is simply stored fat. Okay, so don't get the two confused. Red bone marrow is what produces all of the blood cells in your body, all the different types, red, white, and platelets. Okay. So if you follow this down, I didn't want to go too crazy, but remember you have 5 different types of white blood cells, okay? That would be basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. This one stem cell, depending on the chemistry that's needed, and we'll talk again, because we're talking about white blood cells, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later, will yield granulocytes, which will eventually, become the 3 granulocytes that you see here, or agranulocytes, which will become the monocytes or the lymphocytes. The lymphocytes I really want to spend a lot more time on talking about later because they are the antibody producers. They have a huge effect in clearing germs from your body. Platelets, which really are kind of just like little fragments of cells, really anyway, are essential for blood clotting. They form, again, from the same stem cell that all the other ones formed, but they have a different developmental pathway. Now, you may be asking yourself, wow, Dr. A just skipped over a whole bunch of stuff. Am I going to have to know each intermediate little, stage in blood cell production? Of course you are not. Yeah, I would never ask you to do that, right? So, anyway, I just think that's way too much detail. If you ever really needed to know that, like in a hematology course or something like that, an actual blood study course, that's the only time I can really ever think that you would have to know that. I just want you to know for this class that all blood cells come from the stem cells in the red bone marrow. They go through a successive, sort of development, and then you get the final product. Here we have little chunks of cytoplasm. There's not even any DNA in there, which are called thrombocytes, right? They're also called platelets. They're one and the same. These little cytoplasmic chunks will then enter the bloodstream and form platelets, and which are extremely important for clotting. Now that's coming up in this presentation, so I'm going to save that a little bit for later. So before I get too much further, I think I'm going to end this right here. So we are going to have a little bit of a shorter presentation, about a minute and a half shorter or so. The next step, the next presentation that we're going to be talking about and discussing is blood typing. This is really going to lay the groundwork for talking about the immune responses too. So the next unit is definitely going to be really important.